Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. I am Zaid Rad Al Hussein, President of the International Peace Institute here in New York, welcoming you all, the members of the audience here with us today, and the online audience to a discussion on multilateralism reimagined, a joint discussion or a joint event put together by the International Peace Institute and the elders. And it's my great pleasure and honor to turn over to James Bays.
Thank you very much. I'm James Bays, diplomatic editor of Al Jazeera, and I am going to be moderating this panel. You don't want to hear from me, you want to hear from our panelists. So we're going to get very quickly to questions as we talk about multilateralism, the test of COVID-19, how the international community responds to this and changes the way it works, and of course the much bigger test the whole world faces with the climate crisis. I have Prince Zaid on one side of me, the president of IPI, who you've just heard from, former High Commissioner for Human Rights, former ambassador to the United Nations and to the US for Jordan. But I also have the former president of Ireland, Mary Robinson, who is another one of the elders, the chair of the elders, joining me, and also another former High Commissioner for Human Rights for the United Nations. Let me start by asking you both a question about COVID-19. As we stand right now, the number of official deaths, we know it's much higher than that, hovering around the 4 million mark, and more of those were already this year than the whole of last year. In April last year at the UN Security Council, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, "The world faces the gravest test since the founding of this organization." Well, we have a bit of hindsight now. Did the world pass the test?
No, but may I begin by saying how nice it is to be back in the IPI and have a live audience and a Zoom audience, but also to be back in IPI where one of my fellow elders, Zaid, has taken over recently as president and CEO. The elders have frequently come here when we've come on visits to New York, so it's a very good place to discuss issues. Back to COVID. I have a curious personal sense of COVID. I have been so worried for so long by the climate crisis. I have been talking so much about climate justice. I was very worried in January 2020 because I felt countries are not going to have the ambition for this conference that's going to take place in Glasgow in November of 2020. How are we going to shake them up about the seriousness of the climate crisis? And then COVID hit. It had already affected, obviously, in Wuhan and in China, but it began to affect my last flight, apart from going to Washington with the elders in the last few days, was in March, the 7th and 8th of March 2020. So everything stopped. It kind of turned the world upside down, and it did so very unequally. It was like a mirror of inequality, but it kind of gave us some lessons. We have not coped well. We have not coped well in equitable access to vaccines, etc. But there are lessons we can learn. The lessons are that we need to see health as a crucial issue in all countries, as something that governments need to take responsibility for. We need to know that collective human behavior can actually matter, and that will matter as we deal with the climate crisis. Why I say that is, it was our behavior of responding to the protocols of social distancing, of even lockdowns, etc., that were the only thing until we rolled out the vaccine. We've learned that government matters. We can count the governments that failed. We've learned that science matters. That's also very important for the other crisis, the climate crisis. We need to listen to the climate scientists with the same attention that we listen to the health experts. And a curious thing, compassion matters. We're seeing in every country around the world a compassion for those more affected. And yet we're not coping well with this. This should be an issue where the Security Council was right on top of it, where the General Assembly was right on top of it, where the WHO had far more support. We've had the Preparedness panel, which I know we'll come back to. But, it has caused us all to think. We're all out of our comfort zone. I do honestly believe that on the whole, it will help us to do better at this bad time for multilateralism.
Zaid, if I get your view, an added factor to this, of course, it's 76 years and 4 days since the signing of the UN Charter, and perhaps the world order was already creaking. Some are talking of a new Cold War. The Secretary General's talked about the great fracture. Do you think that backdrop added to the divisions on COVID-19?
Yes, perhaps we were deluding ourselves in imagining that a community that was stronger than the one that it actually existed would sort of help us deal with these crises. And perhaps we couldn't be faulted for thinking that, because there were occasions when community action, collective action by all the member states produced a good result. Just commenting on the remarks made by Mary, it is worth recalling how in 2014, the General Assembly, together with the Secretary General and the Security Council, seized control over the Ebola crisis. And all of us remember the high-level segment of the General Assembly in September of 2014, when there was this determined effort to try to come to grips with this very nasty Ebola outbreak in West Africa. And it's hard for people to understand, given the consequences of this particular crisis, which ranges into every corner of human experience, how somehow the international mechanisms have been adrift and have been trying to deal with this issue piecemeal. And for those who are basically, let's say, innocent and maybe free of thinking in geopolitical terms, it seems to be inexplicable why then we could do it and now we seemingly have been unable to do it.
Well, let me throw that to Mary, because there's one possible factor that's different from 2014-15 and maybe from the global financial crisis, and that perhaps is US leadership. Because at the time of Ebola, I remember the General Assembly meeting, and I remember Samantha Power pushing people, even going to the region. The Trump administration was missing in action, wasn't it?
Yeah, we had 4 really bad years of lack of leadership, and it's actually hard for the United States under Biden, President Biden and Kamala Harris, who are trying very hard to say America is fully back. It's very hard to make up that. We see it in climate. We say even in the rollout of vaccines is remarkable now in the United States and the richer parts of the world. The promise that Biden made before the G7, but the G7 was disappointing. It was disappointing on saying, in general, a sort of billion vaccines by the end of 2022. That's not good enough. The COVAX commitment was $1 billion by 1st of September and another $2 billion in mid-2022. And we need $11 billion to do the job. So I have sympathy and empathy for a Biden administration trying to make up for 4 years of completely lost time internationally. It's not easy, but it affects how we're able to cope.
Zaid, if we look at the various bits that failed, Mary's mentioned the G7, the G20, US leadership. What about here at the United Nations? I was here in the early days in March in that building. There was virtually no one there. The UN was struggling with its teleconferencing systems. The UN Security Council and General Assembly couldn't really find new ways of working. It took them weeks. And then, you know the Security Council well. You used to be Jordan's ambassador on the Security Council. There was complete dysfunction. The Secretary General proposed this ambitious idea of a global ceasefire, but it led to this squabbling between the US and China, with American diplomats trying to insert the term Wuhan virus. It took 3 months to get a resolution.
Yes, I mean, deeply disappointing, almost bewildering, given, again, the scale of this particular crisis, the effects of which have yet to really play themselves out. When you look at countries where the fiscal space for maneuver now is so limited, and the economic pressures are still very attendant because the vaccine rollout has been so slow. Again, one looks at the Security Council, indeed the UN more generally, and you have to remind yourself that this is all still a reflection of the world that exists out there. If the world is in a rather degraded state, then what we find is in the UN, the situation is mirrored similarly. Where the UN can make a difference is in the margins, in the little spaces between those two sort of realities, the reality of the world out there and the reality of the UN, which is very closely mirrored. There's always little space, and small adjustments can lead to quite long-lasting consequences. I think when looking now with hindsight at the international health regulation, it was quite clear to us that even though a pandemic was of this scale, was expected by many, and the warnings were abounded basically, it was quite clear that there was no resolve really to upgrade the international health regulation to a point where you could actually prevent something like this. And so there was a sort of system failure in place as well. It wasn't helped by the squabbling that you spoke of.
Let's talk more about the system failing, Mary, particularly at the WHO. And I mean, one of the things is the WHO opposing travel bans, and yet every single country in the world put a travel ban in place. And it brings us to one of our questions. We've had various people who've submitted questions on social media using the hashtag AskIPI. This is from Annie from Brooklyn. We were given mixed instructions on masking. For the next global crisis, how do we communicate more effectively and transparently to instill deeper trust in our multilateral system while avoiding mass panic?
Well, you know, I have sympathy for Annie. There are a lot of Annies in Ireland, I think, who are asking somewhat similar questions. Actually, I really want to begin by making it clear, this pandemic is not just a health issue. It is a huge global economic, political, social. It has aggravated inequality. It is devastating the poorest countries, already very indebted, more indebted. They didn't get the remittances because the jobs were lost in the rich world. So, you know, we have to bear that in mind. So, you know, things like travel in the rich world, you know, it's important, but actually, you know, it's not as important as the fact that we need to have coped, and we have not yet. But we have a PPPR panel that was co-chaired by one of our fellow elders, Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, and Helen Clark. Also had Ernesto Zedillo, the former president of Mexico, another elder, on the panel. We discussed it in recent days in Washington. It was our first physical meeting getting together. Not all of us could get together, but I'm very glad to say those elders who couldn't be with us, 4 of them were with us for a lot of the time by Zoom, but the rest of us were able to be there together. And we had Gro Brundtland, the former not only Prime Minister of Norway, but also the Director General of the WHO, and she also chairs another panel that had predicted in September 2019, we have to be prepared. There could be a pandemic, and we weren't prepared. And she couldn't have spoken more passionately at our meeting in Washington about the fact that this is not to be thought of as a WHO health issue. The WHO needs a lot more support, as the Preparedness panel put it, but it also has to be elevated to be something that the General Assembly has a special meeting on, as has been recommended, a special resolution on, a declaration on, and then all the steps for a very high level Health Threats Council at head of state level. And how many times she said to us in Washington, head of state level, do you understand me? Not WHO health level. And you know, I cannot emphasize how important that is.
You're saying that now.
Yes.
There's a General Assembly coming up, and
Yes.
there'll be more, maybe some will be virtual, but there'll be more heads of state here in New York.
Yeah.
Is it too tight time scale, or could you get something like this in place? Because it's obviously urgent.
What was really disappointing, the other recommendation is a pandemic convention, and it was somehow left to the WHA, the World Health Assembly, to address that. In fairness to the World Health Assembly, the report had more or less just come out. Yet the idea of postponing for 6 months, consideration of stuff. We were shocked. I can't tell you, that's not right. This has to be dealt with, and we want the General Assembly as the principal organ to actually take the responsibility, work closely with the WHO, of course, and support much more support, economic, financial, and other support for the WHO. We agree with all those recommendations, but there has to be a sense of high-level responsibility. This is a pandemic that has devastated the world. We know it's not going to be the only pandemic. We're not prepared. We haven't coped well. For goodness sake, we need the multilateral cooperation now.
You both know the UN intimately. Why do you think there's a reluctance from some countries for this to be put in New York and made system-wide and not just stuck in a corner, in the health corner, as it were, in Geneva?
Well, it's precisely the point that the origins are obviously related to health, and so the thought was we put it in the health box, which is the World Health Assembly, and we asked them to sort of consider whether or not they should have a framework convention that would allow us or permit us to prevent the next pandemic from happening. And Mary's point has to be taken very seriously. Indeed, it reflects the feeling of all the elders, and in particular Dr. Brundtland, that the impacts are so wide and deep. And if the General Assembly doesn't exert its authority over this issue, then what issue would it exert its authority? Law can be made in two ways. It can be made international law. It can be made by a decision of the Security Council, or it's made through a process that's triggered by General Assembly action. The General Assembly is the nursery of international law. And it ought to take charge if, for example, it were decided by the member states there ought to be a framework convention. An ad hoc committee could be created by the General Assembly, which could meet in Geneva, close to where the health specialists are. But it's the General Assembly in charge. And I think it would give markets, it would give all those to whom the stability of the planet is important, an assurance that the United Nations and the member states are responding in a way that's proportionate to the size and scale of this crisis.
Does the Secretary General have an obligation after that panel's report to push this really hard?
I think all of us have. All of us have. I mean, what a sad commentary it would be on the UN after having experienced this for 2 years, that the net result is a zero, that we're focusing on vaccines, but we have no means to protect ourselves from the next pandemic, which we're told, as Mary said, by scientists, could come ever more frequently. And it would be, I think, tragic for the UN, maybe even fatal for the UN.
We've got a small audience here because of COVID restrictions. Most of the people are watching this online, but we do have one question because it's from someone who's part of the IPI family. It's from the Emeritus Advisor to IPI, Warren Hogue. We're just getting him a microphone, I believe. And he's going to ask his question. Should I look that way? Do you want to stand up, Warren, maybe so that people can see you on the...
Okay. Yeah. And should I face the camera? Good. I'm Warren Hogue of IPI, and I take the point, I'm thinking of all the conversations I've heard over the years where people were asked to justify the United Nations, and they always said, when you get a great transnational problem, you need an institution like the UN. We just got a pandemic. I can't imagine anything more transnational than that. And I think the panelists have pretty much said that the UN's response was disappointing. Right now, there is a situation, ongoing situation, which has to do with the equitable distribution of vaccines. That clearly is an issue for the multilateral community and for the United Nations. Any ideas of how the UN can make it more equitable, and particularly at a time when you're talking about the General Assembly generally represents the world of the Global South, and this is a Global South issue. How will those countries that don't have the means to get vaccines get them, and what can the multilateral system do to make sure they get them?
Let's get both your takes on that, and let me add in, because on our hashtag AskIPI, pretty similar question from Hayley from Ireland. What can be done in preparation for future pandemics to better ensure global vaccine equity? Mary.
Well, thank you, Warren, for that question, and nice to see you. It is incredibly important that we support the existing system, which we call COVAX, which is Gavi. I actually am a former chair of Gavi, so I understand the importance of vaccination for things. It's quite clear that we should have 1 billion vaccines by 2020, September, and 2 billion by mid-2022. That was the kind of expectation, if I could put it that way. And we need overall 11 billion. Unfortunately, because of what's happening in India, it has affected the manufacturer. The sheer Delta variant is so rampant, and it's very, very unfortunate. We need to create the capacities. It was good that President Biden addressed the intellectual property issue, the TRIPS in the WTO issue. But actually, what we really need is a preparedness that understands that we need capacity for vaccination, capacity for ventilators, capacity for equipment right across the board in the developing countries, in the developing world, in the future, and far more at the moment to deal. I keep hearing, we were promised 20%. They've had less than 2%. It's really shocking. It's a shocking lack of solidarity. I wear this special SDGs pin because I remember the solidarity in 2015 of the agenda on development, the 2030 agenda in September, 193 countries agreeing it, and then the Paris Climate Agreement. COVID should have been like that for us, and still needs to be, where we really step up. The inequitable access to vaccines may affect the climate crisis, because if delegates can't get vaccinated, if civil society can't come from the most affected countries and press for the ambition, we may not get a good conference in Glasgow, and so on. It's all interconnected. We utterly need that equity.
Well, I'm going to be a little bit mischievous before I ask you to answer the question by adding in a quote from the man who's the host of the Glasgow conference. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson at one point was recorded telling a group of his MPs about the situation in Britain. The reason we have vaccine success is because of capitalism, because of greed, my friends.
You wonder how many times we have to learn the lesson before it really sinks in, that if we pursue narrow agenda, thin agenda, at the expense of others, we don't really progress very far. And the most notable lesson from the traumas of the Second World War is that if we give priority to the collective agenda, all of us are served, including the individual narrower concerns and interests of states. The scrambling for yourself scrambles it for everybody.
Look at the Delta variant now in the UK.
Right. That's right. And yet, if you think more expansively, we're all served. Sadly, there are too many countries who, and especially in the more recent times, where you've had this sort of chauvinistic nationalism begin to bubble up, that are the acid that has eaten away at something which was degrading for a number of years, the commitment to multilateralism, notwithstanding the efforts of many to hold it together. And the multilateralists were depicted by the populists as being these gray bureaucrats, globalists who are trying to undermine individual culture, identities, enforcing some sort of rather drab bureaucratic world order on everyone else. And that's the way in which we have been depicted. I think the counter-narrative has to be, we've tested your alternative twice. It's led to massive destruction. No, thank you. We may be drab, but we don't create the sort of problems that you yourself inadvertently or sometimes advertently create. We need to find perhaps a better way of doing it. but the collective approach is still the best approach to achieving success.
Mary, I'd like to touch on briefly the origins of COVID. What do you think about having a further inquiry? I know the G7 communique earlier this month, a timely, transparent, expert-led and science-based WHO convened phase 2 COVID origins study is needed. Do you agree with that? And how does that play into all the allegations of politicization of the WHO?
I think it is important that we do as much research and study of the origins for obvious reasons. We need to know. But I'm very sorry that that has become such a dominant issue and such a divisive issue at a time when the real issue is both equitable access to vaccines and other equipment globally to help countries to deal with it, the need for the financial package. I mean, it is remarkable how unequal the world has become. I mean, it was unequal. Climate change was making it more unequal by the climate shocks that were affecting the most vulnerable countries. And then COVID is like a magnifying glass. It has magnified this inequality to such an extent. And that's the real issue, that countries are faced with indebtedness. We actually don't yet know the extent of that inequality. It hasn't quite become evident. Now, addressing those issues and getting on top of them with better consensus is more important than dividing on and politicizing the causes. Yes, we need to know, I think it makes every sense that we need to know, but it's not anything like as vital as the multilateral response to the real world issues for people who've lost their jobs, who've lost their livelihoods, countries so indebted they can't even think about a recovery package. And then the trillions that the richer parts of the world have been able to roll out, and those of us in Europe and in the United States can be very grateful for that, but we have to know that countries are being driven into poverty at the moment. The SDGs are going backwards at the moment.
So what do you do about that? I know the Secretary General of the UN on this has been very strong. He's pushed very hard to the G20 and the G7. He's said, I've pushed for a massive rescue package equivalent to at least 10% of the global economy. How do you get rich countries to agree to something like that?
That we're all imperiled together. It hasn't gone unnoticed that whenever you have a financial crisis or a crisis that threatens the economies of individual countries, we go deep into printing money. You have all forms of monetary policy that's sort of restricted, but I suppose there's an easing, this quantitative easing that can take place, which has proven to be successful under certain conditions. What clearly doesn't work is austerity. That has been proven to be disastrous, and in Europe it was clear it has had disastrous effects. But there is a way of appealing to the sort of a collective sense of belonging here, that none of us will be at peace unless we somehow stitch together the planet in a way that's stable for everybody. We do need the markets to be involved. We do need the bond markets, the insurance markets, the reinsurance markets. They all depend on stability. And when you have economies potentially in turmoil and the lives of so many people wrecked, it doesn't serve economic interests either at a global scale. For the manufacturers of cell phones, they still need access to certain raw materials. There could be a very strong squeeze on supply in those respects. Everyone is affected. It's simply not possible for governments to do this alone. You need investors, you need asset managers, you need those who have a stake in the stability of the planet to also pitch in. Ultimately, it's about the existence of the human species, and not us alone, but biodiversity that is shrinking at such an alarming rate. And it's all connected, as Mary said. These are all part of one system. There is an initiative called the One Health, It's the health of the planet, the health of us as a species, the health of all flora and fauna. We should care about all of it as one system. And if we can think like that, we can overcome these problems.
Mary, there is an argument that, you talked about COP26 coming up, there's an argument that just a few days before the G20 meeting is just as important or even more important because of the issues you've just raised, but also because of climate finance as well. What will you be hoping comes out of that G20 meeting in Rome at the end of October?
There was disappointment about the G7. I think that's clear. Either on the vaccine side, yes, 1 billion vaccines in a general sense by 2022, but not really addressing the scale of the problem. And the failure to meet that long promised 100 billion a year by 2020. That was at the Copenhagen conference in 2009. And yet we haven't been able to meet it. And developing countries are watching the trillions of the economic packages, the COVID recovery packages, and saying, how come it's not possible to meet this? So that becomes difficult. And I think the G20 is an incredibly important meeting to create the trust to get a good climate conference. If we don't create that trust, I fear that, and we've had COPs each year. We had COP21 in Paris. I was the special envoy of the Secretary General for that COP. It was a vital, important COP. This COP in Glasgow is of a similar order. We've had COPs since that were, move things along. This is vital. This is a make or break kind of moment. And as we go, in August, we're going to see what the scientists will be saying, and it will be worse and worse and frightening. And the elders are very careful. Our mission from Nelson Mandela is to bring hope. So I'm hoping that what we're saying on this panel is not making people, feel any kind of despair, because we know we can solve these problems. We just need the political will.
You said at the beginning that you hoped the pandemic will concentrate minds.
Yes.
We've had the pandemic. We're going to have this G20 literally back to back with the COP meeting. Do you think that's good timing, that you might get some momentum? You get the finance ministers and then you'll get the heads of state and the climate experts?
I think we have to work very hard on this momentum. The elders are certainly very conscious of this, but everybody, and I'm aware that there have been good, if you like, breakthroughs in realization. The G7 of environmental ministers aligned with 1.5. The International Energy Agency, which is it's rather a conservative body, but it has a very good director of it, Fatih Birol. It, for the first time, aligned its report with 1.5 degrees. We have a lot of business and a lot of investment. Mark Carney is doing a very good job in his capacity as envoy to get a huge commitment of investment. Pension funds, I've just learned, have made huge commitments. So, there are reasons for feeling that we can have a good result, but it does require, it requires the kind of trust commitment of that 100 billion very clearly there before, and that has to be at the G20 at the latest.
Okay, well, I'd like to talk more questions about climate in a moment, but we've got a couple of questions here on the hashtag AskIPI about the UN system and how it responds to how multilateralism responds to fast-moving things that need fast-moving action, like a pandemic. This is from Juan Pablo from Spain. In a state-centric system, what traction does the UN have to trigger member states to take collaborative action on climate, pandemics, and other human security issues?
It's a great question. In part, the answer is found in the way the system is set up to prevent pandemics, the current system, the international health regulation. It is an entirely voluntarily, or let's say a system based on voluntary disclosure. If a particular country is the host or the site of a particular outbreak, it's incumbent upon them to investigate, to assess, and then once a conclusion is reached, within 24 hours, the World Health Organization has to be informed. So there is a requirement, 24-hour window, once the assessment is reached. But that assessment, the arrival at a conclusion, can take weeks, by which time the particular pathogen could have spread well across the region, if not beyond. So there is a system failure here. And the question is, how do we prevent something like that happening again? If you have a proper system in place, and we have in other legal realm, you have means of verification, for example, many such systems. And I think it will be incumbent upon governments to look at what exists elsewhere and see whether something could be adapted such that in the health sector, we have a system, a mechanism that would, in time, provide the sort of effect that you'd want to see.
Mary, this is a once-in-a-century pandemic. There are other big issues and problems that face the world. If they have a famine or tsunami or earthquakes, the UN humanitarian system has ways to respond. I mean, do you think there are other things the UN should be thinking about? I mean, I don't want to go into the realms of science fiction, but an asteroid strike, for example. I mean, who's doing planning for these sort of things in the UN system?
I think the real need, which was identified very, very clearly by the Preparedness panel, if I can call it that Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf and Helen Clark chaired, they are warning the world. We have to prepare, and we have to prepare knowing that it is very likely, because of the way we have lived, the way we have encroached on wild animals, the way we have, lessened their space. We've had the Ebola, we've had the SARS, we've had and now the coronavirus. It's so likely we will have others. But it's also part of the capacity of the world at this time of populism, nationalism. I was glad that this morning, under the goodwill of the Irish ambassador to the UN, and Ireland is now on the Security Council, we were able to have an informal breakfast with the members of the Security Council. Obviously it was informal, it was private. I'm not going to talk about in any general terms about what was said, but we were encouraging the Security Council to try to rebuild trust in their capacity to take decisions in the way that they have a responsibility for under Article 34 in particular of the UN Charter.
But if you're, and you had this job in the past, if you're an ambassador from an individual country, there is a tendency, isn't there, just to look at the immediate problems in front of you. The big issues. Yes, COVID is an immediate problem in front of us right now, but the next pandemic, is that a priority right now?
It ought to be. I think it's clear, as Mary said, in the UN Charter, under Article 34, that the Security Council may investigate any situation that might create friction, international friction, and be a threat to international security, peace and security, may investigate any issue. There's a sense within the Security Council that it's either a threat or it's not a threat. The Charter makes it clear that there is a space in between. This may be, and that the Security Council ought to investigate. The Security Council produces law. So there is this sense that you do need to have a vigilance. You do need to have constant horizon scanning. And maybe it's, of course, not just the duty of the Security Council, it's duty of the General Assembly. The Convention on Biodiversity, for instance, has not met often the targets that it sets for itself. We've seen the collapse of biodiversity. Last September, in September of 2020, there was an Outlook report which basically gave a very damaging picture to all of us on the state of the planet. And so, yes, you expect an ambassador to represent the country's interests, but also given the space, given they are working within a multilateral organization, there is a duty also to think of the whole and to how one can advance the interests of the whole. I used to say that a multilateral ambassador is often called upon to betray his country or her country, in the sense that you're giving your initial instructions. But if there's any hope of compromise, you often have to go back on those instructions and modify your position so that you can all reach a position in the middle. If there's a rigid sort of adherence to by all countries to their own positions, we could not have regulated anything on this planet, from telecommunications to standards to aircraft regulations, you name it, nothing would be possible. So there is an element of starting with your own national position, listening to others, and then moving it along, changing it, adapting it. And that's essentially what we need to do if we're going to forestall these future and expected developments from taking place.
When you mentioned the Security Council, you mentioned horizon scanning. When I started as a reporter here at the UN Security Council used to have meetings on that. Doesn't anymore.
Yes, and I think it's terrible that they don't have it. And for that reason, at least when I was on the Security Council, we would be constantly surprised that suddenly you have a conflict emerge somewhere, and we should have had a long lead-in time before having to cope with the effects of the armed conflict. Because the tremors, the seismographs that the UN has, most commonly in the form of the human rights monitoring, are sensitive enough to pick up the instabilities early on. And the Security Council should have an interest in all these developments at a much earlier stage than it currently does.
I should mention that while I was researching for this, I found the podcast you both did last month on the Security Council, the Finding Humanity podcast from the elders, and I do recommend anyone who's watching that to listen. And I am going to, before we get back to climate, we do have one question on the Security Council, which is slightly off topic, but let's just pause for this for a moment and then we'll go back to climate. As the UN Security Council is about to agree on the renewal of the only cross-border humanitarian corridor in Syria, what leverage does the UN system have to uphold and promote respect of basic humanitarian principles in such a protracted conflict?
I hope it's not breaching some confidentiality of an informal breakfast, but I did raise this with the Security Council this morning and emphasized how important it is at least to have the existing humanitarian corridors. We actually need more, but for goodness sake, to renew. And, it is very disheartening when humanitarian issues become politicized. I mean, you just have to be in places where there is, where you see deeply malnourished children, women raped, etc., in those sort of situations, and then to think that it's politicized at a level to prevent access, to prevent. So I hope, of course, that will be renewed.
You have a comment on that?
Yeah, only to say that IPI hosted a discussion not long ago on this, and basically in support of the position that Mary expressed just now.
We heard Mary, with regard to the climate crisis earlier on, saying she thought the pandemic would concentrate people's minds and nations' minds. Could it not have another effect, that nations have no money and really can't concentrate on climate this year, and maybe everything could get pushed to the Stockholm conference that's happening the following year?
I mean, again, if you're thinking narrowly and thinly about your own condition only, it's very difficult to perceive of how you'd find a way out of this. If there's a collective mechanism by which we're all thinking together, using our brain power to try and break this problem, bringing in the various capital markets, the regional banks, the regional development banks, the IFIs, there must be a means by which we can find the monies, make them available. Just looking at ESG funds, for instance, I mean, well over $1 trillion, 2 miles away from where we are now in Wall Street. There is money galore that needs to park itself. The stock markets did very well out of the pandemic. A lot of the volatility served the interests of short-term investors. it's not in the interest of the long-term investors to see a world that's in turmoil. And so there are allies to governments that can be called upon. Mary mentioned the big state public pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds. And it's a matter of thinking elastically, thinking together and collaboratively, that we will be able to find solutions to these. But if it's everyone going it alone, certainly we won't. And we will, find ourselves in a cul-de-sac from which there's no escape. But we don't believe that we've come this far as a human species to get stuck in a cul-de-sac. So the focusing of minds, if it hasn't happened, it can still happen. The Biden administration is wrestling with many enormous problems, both at home and now confronting them internationally. But I think the direction of travel is correct. It's just more of an investment that we need to see when it comes to the issue of vaccines and also on climate change from many countries, including most especially the BRICS countries. And there's concern about their position, and they have to be persuaded to be more involved. But as both of you said, the G20 meeting will be critical in that regard.
Okay, a question now from Maria Jose from Colombia. A group of international lawyers has recently defined the term ecocide. What would be the impact and value of recognizing ecocide as an international crime?
Well, I'm aware of this long thinking about how serious the climate crisis is and should we think in terms of ecocide. I remember a wonderful woman called Paula Higgins who started this as an NGO and sadly died much too young. And I know now there is a group of lawyers, I'm not in direct contact with them. I kind of agree, curiously, with the point that Zaid made, that we need a holistic approach, the One Health approach, but also to in some way recognize other species and their right to exist, because we see the extinction of species. I took part in an event for the Venice Biennale this year, the Architectural Biennale, postponed like everything else from last year, with a number of artists. I was out of my comfort zone, but we actually designed a future assembly. We were commemorating the 75th anniversary of the UN, and we said the UN, yes, but the future assembly must be broader. And it's interesting, because I didn't know this, that there is a movement towards thinking along similar lines. I actually think that probably is a way that will bring home to us. We are stewards of this world. We need to walk with a light footprint, as Barbara Ward said so many years ago, and yet we are destroying our habitat and destroying our potential future. If we destroy it too much, we don't have a future. The world will recover rather quite rapidly without us. But that's not something to contemplate. It's not something the elders want to contemplate. But the more we can learn from indigenous wisdom and actually have a better and more harmonious connection with our world and bring together very definitely the Conference on Climate and the Convention on Biological Diversity. In my view, the more they could merge, the better for the world.
Your take on that?
So there is a draft circulating in the General Assembly, which basically seeks to confer personhood rights to flora and fauna, using this idea that Mary spoke of, the right to exist, as something that's endemic to all species. It's not just that humans have a right to life. All species ought to have, must have a right to exist as a species. And the draft has a mechanism in place. There's a list called the Red List, the ICUN Red List. And once a species is on that red list, it's endangered. It faces extinction. And the idea is that if the convention is passed, or this instrument is passed, that governments are expected under the Convention on Biological Diversity to protect these species of flora and fauna. If they're not doing so, then certain individuals or institutions within each country could take the matter to court and have the government in question answer to the question of why it is that it's not doing enough to protect the species. So there is some really creative thinking taking place, and we need to think creatively, which may save the current degradation of biodiversity by having governments accept that they need to be audited and potentially censured by their own individuals or by their own citizens if they're defaulting on their obligations. And if there is a need for monies to do this, then mechanisms can be thought of as to how it is that you then provide those monies to countries that need it. And in certain countries where the diversity is vast, Indonesia, for example, and I could quite easily see some sort of facility to help them. But it goes back to this Mary's point of having all of it viewed as one. The climate crisis, the degradation of biodiversity, the pandemic, these are global issues that need to be dealt with almost through one lens because we're all ultimately affected.
Mary, let me read you a quote from another elder. Now, he's not one of your elders, but arguably the elder statesman of natural history, Sir David Attenborough.
Oh, yes.
The natural world is greatly diminished, that is undeniable. Our climate is warming fast, that is beyond doubt. But the question science forces us to address is whether we're on the verge of destabilizing the entire planet. What is where are you ahead of this COP26? How hopeful are you? How worried are you?
I know that we're going to get another report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC.
You got an idea what it says?
I'm told it's going to be very worrying,
right,
because obviously we know, we all know, things are getting, look at the heat now in the western part of the United States, look at the fires there have been, look at the flooding there's been, and then, this is recently in the developed part, but what brought me to climate justice was the awareness that climate disproportionately hit the poorest countries, the poorest communities, the small island states, the indigenous peoples, who also happen to be the black and brown and indigenous peoples of our world, a kind of racial injustice. And I could go on about other layers, the gender dimensions of that, the intergenerational injustice, etc. But I think what I'm aware of is that we have this unique opportunity of COP26 to get on track for 1.5. The challenge is enormous. David Attenborough knows this well. So do all of the leaders. I mean, while we were in Washington for our physical board meeting, we had a good discussion with John Kerry. I'm delighted that John Kerry is driving the Biden administration internationally on climate because he absolutely understands the seriousness of the issue. That's important. It's very important that the United States and China, etc., would get on track to really say COP26 is like the Paris Climate Agreement, an essential conference to get us on track, both financially, with not just the 100 billion a year, but the trillions from the private sector that have to go into the developing countries also being able to go green as they want to go, but they need the investment, they need the training, they need the skills, they need the solidarity, basically. And so I'm of the view that we have to work very hard because we have left it very late to take the steps we need to take. It is a crisis. How often does Greta Thunberg say to us, on behalf of the children and young people of the world, it is a crisis. Why don't you deal with it as a crisis? And we're still not quite there. We're getting to it.
And you mentioned John Kerry there.
Yes.
How much do you think there was backsliding because of the, not here in the US, but globally because of the Trump administration? That gave space to other governments to ignore the issue.
Oh, undoubtedly. Everybody took their foot off the pedal once there was no leadership from the United States. As I said earlier, now 4 years of a lack of that leadership makes it harder, for example, on climate finance. The United States has promised $5.7 billion by 2024 at the summit on Earth Day. That seemed good in comparison before, but it isn't. The United States should commit now to at least 11.4 billion, double that, to be even credible with countries like the UK or France or Germany in what they are committing in climate finance. So it's hard, to make up. And John Kerry is working night and day, knowing this and urging this in the US system and internationally, and trying to really drive and build trust on it. And thank goodness.
Of course, Greta Thunberg came up in a discussion like this about the climate crisis. Do you think the UN can learn a lesson from people like Greta, from climate activists, and the way perhaps they engage young people, they use social media to be a little bit more of activists and to perhaps work around member states and get a constituency of the public itself?
So I had a very interesting discussion with my life partner, my wife and my daughter yesterday about this. And the argument that they were positing is that it's wrong for us to speak about empowering people. They're already self-empowered. You just have to get out of their way. Governments get in the way of people. Institutions get in the way of people. Just allow them to breathe, and you will see what happens. Grassroots activism, I think, and this is where Mary began her most illustrious career. It's very powerful, it's very connected, it's tactile, it's connected to the immediacy of the problem, and it sees long-range issues as well. And all too often we get in the way. We just have to get out of the way and just give them space, and things can happen. You see the most amazing courage, you see the most amazing sort of determination to make adjustments. I do agree with Greta, though, that we, our generation, shouldn't step comfortably into our graves, having lived a life dependent on carbon and having created this Ponzi scheme for them to then settle. That we have to sort it out before we move on. We have to sort it out for them. And the tipping points are arriving fast, as the IPCC will make clear in September. And so the requisite urgency is now upon us to do the right thing. We have to be able to juggle many things at the same time. Time hasn't allowed us now the luxury of sequencing and so forth. We have to be capable enough to do all of it together.
James, if I may, I want to just build on what Zaid was saying, because the elders have taken very seriously the intergenerational dialogue. We have encouraged young climate activists, and some very young climate activists, to write blogs on our website, theelders.org, and they are very thoughtful blogs. And I have engaged a lot of them. Shia Bastida and others are my friends. And I've just learned something very profound from my own experience. When I was growing up, the intergenerational was one way. You listened to the older person, you absorbed their wisdom, and you benefited, you thought, from it, and that was it. That's completely different now. Young people are so smart, so connected, but most of them want that intergenerational. They don't want us. I don't agree about getting out of the way. I don't think that was what Zaid meant. No, it's actually it's a connection together that's so important, and we will benefit enormously from the fact that there is such a sense among so many young climate activists that they are citizens of the world. They care about those more affected than they are. They talk wonderfully in a very solidarity language, and we can learn a lot from them.
So the UN should perhaps communicate in different ways. I mean, the Secretary General really cares about this issue, but is getting his suit trousers wet on the front of Time magazine still the way to communicate?
Well, certainly, I think the UN has recognized, and definitely that was something that Kofi Annan and Ban Ki-moon recognized. They needed to reach out. They needed to reach out to the business community, to civil society more, et cetera, et cetera. I think now the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, knows and connects well with young people and with civil society. So I think there is a recognition of that.
It's been a fascinating discussion. Mary, would you like to have the last word?
Thank you for the last word. I accept it because I know I can speak on behalf of the President and CEO of IPI, because he's also, as he says himself, he's on the radical young wing of the elders. And I want to come back to something I mentioned briefly earlier. As elders, we are charged with bringing hope. The subjects we've been discussing don't make it easy. Your questions, James, were very good questions, but they were tough questions. You know, this is a tough time, and we have to have hope. One of the things the elders have done is mark as best we can each year the founding day, which is the birthday of Nelson Mandela. He brought us together on the 18th of July 2007, and often in July we try to mark all the values he stood for, the forgiveness, the incredible life, the incredible role he played as president of his country, the rainbow generation, you know, the extraordinary changes that took place, but then his subsequent role, etc. And we have this year an initiative called the State of Hope. A number of us as elders have recorded, because it's in virtual times, speeches, and were responded to by Malala, were responded to by Gordon Brown or others, as a start of an engagement, very much a state of hope, because we believe this is also necessary in our world. It's easy to let the events depress and almost cause, and if that happens, people say, I can't deal with this, and put the head down. And you know, if I may end with what I often message on the climate crisis to audiences, which is a bit like this. The climate crisis and the COVID crisis, they're far too important. The climate crisis is far too important to be left to governments, etc. Every single one of us should take 3 steps. The first step is to make the climate crisis personal in your own life. And you know you've done that because you're recycling more carefully, you're using energy more efficiently, you're changing your diet. Something personal. Own the issue. Own the problem. And then when you've done that, get angry about those who aren't doing enough. Whether it's governments, whether it's corporations, whether it's investment, whether it's cities, they all should be stepping up more. And you can feel, I've done my bit. I can speak out, I can vote, I can join organizations, I can make my voice heard. And the third thing is by far the most important. We have to imagine this world that we need to be hurrying towards very rapidly. We need to be almost there by 2030. What is this world? It's going to be much healthier. It's going to be much more equal because we'll have had to bring developing countries with us with all of the steps that we need to take in access to energy, the climate, the equitable access to vaccines, etc. And so the green jobs, the greening of cities, the rewilding, the new convention on a whole holistic rights of species not to be extinct, etc. All of this is the exciting world we have to move forward. And I end with the words of Nelson Mandela in a very succinct way. It always seems impossible until it is done.